Julia Boorstin, welcome to Everyday MBA. Now, when you were 13, your mother told you that by the time you grew up, women would be just as powerful as men. Unfortunately, today, decades later, gender gaps have really not closed as much as I guess your mother may have hoped. But as you became a journalist, you found that women were succeeding, not in spite of, but because of their unique strengths. Can you explain what do you mean by that?
Well, I think that, just to go back to your first comment about my mom, when I was growing up, I figured, there were all these people who are aware of gender gaps. And by the time I was in the workforce, things would be equal and I would have just as many opportunities as men would. And I was struck when I entered the workforce in 2000, straight out of college, that the gaps were so massive. I mean, even today, women CEOs are just 8% of the Fortune 500. And that is an all-time high. The numbers have been much lower. And then if you look at venture capital funding, which is so essential in fueling the next generation of amazing tech companies, about 3% of venture capital dollars over the past decade have gone to female founders. So I think the gaps are massive, but what I saw as a business reporter, first at Fortune magazine and then at CNBC, where I've been for 16 years, slowly, gradually, more and more women, not only making it into the C-suite, but also founding really impressive game-changing companies. So I was first shocked to see how bad things actually were in the workforce. And then since then, I've been reassured and inspired by seeing so many phenomenal female leaders.
I guess I'm shocked too. I'm going to maybe ask about that or talk about that in a little bit, but your book, When Women Lead, it incorporates interviews with more than 60 female CEOs and leaders, and it reveals some counterintuitive approaches that women running some of the world's most innovative and successful companies are using. Can you give us an example? What is one counterintuitive story from the book that you feel is particularly powerful, and what can we learn from it?
Well, look, I think there's this archetype of leaders being always confident, leading with a vision that is unwavering and making decisions that then they're disseminated across the company and everyone follows those decisions, and really sort of this image of male archetype of confident top-down leadership. And in fact, that's not necessarily the best kind of leadership. And I was struck by the importance of humility and the idea of vulnerability being really valuable to help leaders get the information and data and perspectives they need in order to be successful. So I think that there's no one way to lead. And I think the archetypes should be a lot more diverse and varied than they are now, because I think that we all can learn from various leadership styles and maybe think about the characteristics that we have that we want to develop, that we can get better at, that don't look anything like that stereotype of top-down male stereotypical leadership.
The kind of skills that I see being critical today, I guess, now that you're talking, I guess I would kind of consider them to be more female type of traits if I want to be stereotypical myself or whatever. But the traits of empathy, authenticity, of really caring about more than just business, but also the people and the society and the environment and so forth. You found that women who thrive and are successful often share traits that make them uniquely equipped to lead. What are some of the most important traits, and how can women and all of us really develop them within ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a great point. I think what's so important about my book is, look, I am not a biologist. I am not talking in any way about biological differences. I'm talking about socialized things, socialized traits and characteristics that people are trained to believe women are more likely to do this, men are more likely to do this. And it really has nothing to do with what men and women are actually good at or capable of. And the characteristics that enabled the women in my book to defy the odds and to be among the minority of women who had managed to succeed, those are traits that would be valuable for anyone, male or female, to adopt. So I think you're right also that these are incredibly volatile times in the business world. It feels like It's hard to plan ahead, whether it's the pandemic or economic downturns. Things seem to be changing day to day. And now more than ever, it's really important to reconsider leadership and to think about solving problems for the long term, thinking big picture, and taking the kind of approach that the women in my book have really adopted. And one of those things, I mean, you mentioned empathy before, but another one is contextual thinking. This idea that in a meeting or with a problem, you can either drive towards a quick solution. Okay, we have a problem. What's going to solve this problem right now? Women have been found to, in those environments, ask more questions about tangential things. And it can be frustrating to people. Someone might think, why is she asking this question about this thing that's only marginally related to this problem we're solving right now? And men have been found to traditionally drive more quickly towards an immediate solution. But guess what? If you're trying to get to the heart of a problem and solve the big picture issue, it's actually incredibly valuable to ask those questions and to pull on those strings of things that are related. And to take that big picture approach, you're more likely to, in looking at the forest through the trees, come up with a big picture, longer term solution. There's one idea that I write about in my book, and this idea of being a fire preventer rather than a firefighter. And firefighters are absolutely necessary, right? And it's a high risk job. And firefighters get a lot of attention for sweeping in and saving the day. But at the end of the day, wouldn't it be better if we just didn't have fires in the first place? And that approach of contextual thinking, thinking about the big picture, what can we do to fix the situation so the fires don't happen? That ultimately is a characteristic that women are more likely to adopt in the workplace, and is a really valuable trait for anyone to think about things that way.
Diversity, just like in our stock portfolios, we need diversity to succeed over time. Maybe one element of that may perform in a different way or a different time. So you're saying diversity in the people that we have in leadership and how we embrace that in the organization is incredibly important, male, female, and everything in between and all around that.
There's so much data about how a diversity of ideas is simply more valuable, and also about how diverse leaders, women and people of color, are more likely to foster diversity in the people who work for them. And women in general, if you look at female leaders, they're more likely to care about both gender and racial diversity in their workforce. So one way to get diversity across an organization is to have more diversity at the top of an organization.
We are here with CNBC senior media and tech reporter Julia Boorstin. We're talking about her new book, When Women Lead, What They Achieve, Why They Succeed, and How We Can Learn from Them. Julia, what is your advice for other women who may be listening now and currently feel that they are being stifled in their careers because they are women? What should they do?
Well, one thing that's interesting, and I have to say, I'm very optimistic. I think there's a huge amount of opportunity right now. And in writing this book, I didn't want to be drowning in how hard it is. I didn't want to be drowning in all the data about how women are outnumbered. It's so hard. It's so hard. And so my solution to wanting to find hope and optimism for myself was to ask women what they did to manage to not only succeed despite the odds, but not get discouraged because of those odds. So my advice to women who are dealing maybe with bias in the workplace, or maybe they're feeling like they're being held back because they don't fit the image of what a male leader or a male executive in their workplace looks like, is to benefit from understanding bias. And there were a couple of women I spoke to who said that once they could figure out that a specific challenge was actually just bias and stereotype, it was much easier for them to navigate around it. There's one female founder I spoke to, her name is Aya Badir, and she's the founder of a company called Little Bits, which is like a kids technology company. She's Lebanese, she's a woman, she's an immigrant. She faced all sorts of different kinds of bias, but she said, I asked her, how did it not just totally discourage you? How did you keep on going in the face of so much rejection? And she said, look, I could identify it as bias. And once I knew that someone was dismissing me because of bias, it didn't bother me as much. She said she thinks of it like remembering a jacket when it's cold outside.
Hmm.
As long as you remember your jacket, you're going to be okay. And you just have to treat it as part of your ordinary, part of your ordinary day and going about your business. So she said, once I understand that someone's treatment of you has nothing to do with you, you could say, okay, this isn't about me. I'm not going to let this bother me, but maybe there is some feedback in here that is valuable. Let me figure out which part of the criticism, which part of the blowback could actually be something I could learn from and grow from, and which part of it has nothing to do with me. And so I shouldn't let it get me down.
I like that you're looking also at the positive side of it. What are some of the advantages that being a woman gives? I mean, are there advantages there that?
Of course, there are so many
What are
advantages
those things
to
that we
different
should do?
perspectives. Yes. And so one thing I would point out is that, there are a lot of male dominated industries. At the beginning of this conversation, I cited the fact that 8% of the Fortune 500 CEOs are women. Oftentimes women are in the minority in an industry, in the minority in a leadership team. But that can actually be used to women's advantage as well. And that's because having an outsider perspective can be hugely valuable. It means that you're not sucked into the groupthink. You're not sucked into the status quo of the way things have always been done. And you can use your outsider perspective to bring a fresh perspective. And in the book, I write about some women who really have reformed the industries that they were in and use the fact that they were always kind of outsiders to do things totally differently and also see new markets. I'll mention the example of Sally Krawcheck, who was at one time the most powerful woman on Wall Street. And she did things her own way. She was at Citigroup, and she fought to get some of their investors repaid when they lost more money than they expected to during the financial downturn of 2008, 2009. And everyone said, why would you do this? Why would you put yourself out on a limb like this? You don't need to pay back those investors. She said, I just think this is the right thing to do. And down the line, she was always able to say, I'm not going to do what everyone else assumes I'm going to do. I'm going to do what I think is right. I've always been an outsider, and I'm going to use that as an advantage. Now she runs a financial institution called Ellevest, which is targeting female investors. What she realized after decades working on Wall Street is that women need to invest differently because they often live longer, because they have a different demographic path than men do. Maybe they take time off to have kids. Maybe they're going to be living many more years, so they need to have more retirement savings, and that this whole financial system had been oriented around men. But she said, hey, I see that there's an opportunity here that the status quo was not tapping into. There's also another idea that I found fascinating, this idea of cultural numbness. If you spend enough time in an organization as part of a machine, you become numb to some things about the culture. You become numb maybe to some things that aren't great about the culture. But if you have an outsider perspective, you're more immune to that numbness. And in fact, there's a lot of data showing that women are more likely to be immune to that issue of cultural numbness and to identify things that should change. And especially when it comes to the question of like ethical decisions, like what Sally Krawcheck did when she was trying to get investors repaid, women are more likely to push for those higher ethical standards.
Cultural numbness. That's interesting. I think maybe men suffer from a bit of that. Perhaps I have, because as I mentioned earlier, the 8%, the 3% you mentioned earlier in the interview, I guess I would have been surprised in 2000 to find that as well. And maybe that's just because I'm culturally numb. What should men know and recognize and do? And how can men be more supportive of women in business and overall?
Yeah. And I think what's great about this book, and the reason I am so optimistic, is it's not that men need to be aware of these issues to be supportive of women. Men should be aware of these issues to help themselves too. And for instance, VC investors would get better returns if they invested in companies with more women as leaders. Then the data shows that female founders are more likely to yield returns faster than male founders. I mean, there's so many financial advantages to being aware of diversity. I think it's also really important to note that a lot of these gender gaps are not out of any malice. People aren't intending, for the most part, people have no intention of holding women back. But what's behind these gaps is bias, but also the very simple idea of pattern matching. people tend to want to follow patterns. So if you're an investor and you see that Mark Zuckerberg and people like him found really successful companies, when you're looking for the next founder, you're looking for someone who reminds you of Mark Zuckerberg. And if you're wanting to invest in a CEO or a company, you're like, which CEO reminds me of other successful CEOs? So we get stuck in this feedback loop of trying to match these patterns. And it's interesting because sometimes women fall prey to this as well, in terms of assuming that if you're a CEO, you're going to look like a very particular archetype. So I think sometimes just acknowledging that these patterns are so powerful, and it is our human instinct to want to try to feed, to follow these patterns and feed this cycle, I think prevents us from identifying huge opportunity. So if you're in a workplace and you get to pick someone to be on your team, your instinct might be to pick someone who reminds you of yourself, but that actually might be the worst outcome, because then you won't have a diversity of ideas, which would be far more effective. So I think that it's good to acknowledge that this isn't about malice. No one's trying to do the wrong thing, but these patterns are really dominant in society, and they can prevent everyone, male and female, from finding success. So think about asking someone to join your team, or hiring someone, or promoting someone. If you think about promoting someone who reminds you of someone in power, you're more likely to promote or hire a man. And then we just end up stuck in these biases and not actually looking at the data. So I think identifying the patterns and really just time after time finding the data. There's so many tools now to access data about everything, whether it's a hiring tool or trying to figure out who deserves a promotion or which contractor to go with. There's so much data. Leverage the data and let the data separate you from your bias. Everyone has bias. Identify it and find tools to separate yourself from it.
Our guest today is journalist and media and tech reporter Julia Boorstin. We're talking about her new book, When Women Lead: What They Achieve, Why They Succeed, and How We Can Learn from Them. Julia, we have reached the action item round of the show. I'm wondering if you could please provide us with 3 quick action items that our listeners can do to begin to take advantage of the ideas and advice in your book.
Well, the main thing I would say is that everyone has the ability to improve upon their skills. And self-competition is the best way to do that. I was impressed to find that the women who had defied the odds and founded these game-changing companies, they didn't come out of the womb ready to lead. They didn't graduate from college ready to found a great game-changing company. Everyone worked on their own skill set and worked to improve. And all of us have that same ability to improve. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that leaders, good executives, employees, they are made and not born. And that gives us all so much opportunity to improve upon ourselves. So I think the action item is figure out what you want to improve at and figure out your own benchmarks. Compete against yourself. Don't pit yourself against a colleague or a rival company. Figure out what you can do, because that is what you can control. Set benchmarks, set timetables of when you want to see that improvement, and figure out how to measure your progress. That is the best way to improve. So I would say that's number 1. Number 2, I would say, think about your confidence as being on a dial. You will be more successful if you're not confident all the time. You'll be more successful if, when you're making a decision, when you're dealing with a challenge, you turn down your confidence. Turn down your confidence to gather information from everywhere, from as many diverse sources of information as possible. Then once you've made your decision based on all those different ideas, once you've made your decision, then is the time to turn back up your confidence and execute. But I think it's so powerful to think about confidence as being something that you should turn up and turn down. And then number 3 is, I could go on forever, but if I had to pick one more thing, I would say it's about the importance of adaptability. And we talk about IQ, intelligence, we talk about EQ, emotional quotient, but I think adaptability is key. Adaptability means you're humble enough to identify when things aren't going right. you're not so stuck in following a plan, that you can read the data, you can talk to people on the ground and figure out when it's time to pivot. And it's a willingness to say goodbye to maybe an idea or something that you felt really connected and tied to. And it's also about a growth mindset. So I think that adaptability is key, and understanding in this crazy world we live in where things seem to be changing all the time, you need to be nimble. That's about planning ahead, do everything you can, as one of the CEOs in my book put it, belts and suspenders. You got to go in ready for any scenario, and then know that something's going to happen that you still didn't expect and didn't anticipate. You have to be willing to drop your plans and pivot based on the data at hand.
Well, Julia, it's been great speaking with you today. We're almost out of time, but before I let you go, one last question. You've given us some great advice here today, but what was the best piece of advice that you ever received, and how has it shaped who you are?
The best piece of advice I ever received was from my first boss at Fortune magazine. And he told me to just do it. He told me not to be afraid, not to be held back by what I've done before, and to just take a risk. And what he was specifically referring to was to encourage me to go on TV and talk about a story I had done. I was afraid I was 22 years old and afraid to go on live television. And he said, what's the worst that can go wrong? Sometimes the only way you learn how to do something is by actually doing it. And I think we can all be held back by our fears of the new or the unknown, or the fear of embarrassment, or of failure. But sometimes you just have to get out there and do it. And I think about that a lot and try to push myself outside of my comfort zone, because really, what's the worst that can happen? And there's usually only upside.
That is Julia Boorstin. Get her book, When Women Lead. Julia, thank you so much for being our guest today on Everyday MBA.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.